I didn't want to do it at first, and they'd been after me to do one for about 2 years. And I thought, well, this is going
Picture this. A plane falls from the sky on New Year's Eve. 7 people die in a fireball over a Texas field. Among them, one of the most famous faces in American entertainment history. And when investigators finally piece together what happened next, not with the crash, but with the money, they uncover something nobody expected. Ricky Nelson was supposedly broke. His divorce had been a financial catastrophe. His career had cooled decades earlier. Creditors were lined up at the door. His children were reportedly about to inherit nothing but a mountain of debt and a name that used to mean something. But here's where the story takes a turn nobody saw coming. Hidden inside his music catalog, the songs, the royalties, the rights, sat a fortune so enormous that even the judges handling his estate were floored. And the record labels, who had been quietly siphoning it off for years, they eventually got caught. What followed was one of the most dramatic financial reversals in music history. A dead man's legacy turned his children into millionaires, and one child got absolutely nothing, for a reason that will stop you cold. Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now. Drop a like if you love stories that go beyond the headlines. Share this with someone who grew up listening to Ricky Nelson. And leave a comment telling us, did you know any of this? Because most people don't. Let's start at the very beginning. Ricky Nelson didn't just grow up in the public eye, he was practically born into it. His father, Ozzie Nelson, was a band leader and entertainer. His mother, Harriet Hilliard, was already an established film actress when Ricky arrived on May 8, 1940, in Teaneck, New Jersey. From the moment he could walk and talk, Ricky's world was defined by microphones, cameras, and audiences. The family's radio show, The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet, had been running since 1944, and at first, actors played the two Nelson boys. But Ricky and his older brother David pushed back. They wanted to play themselves. By 1949, they had won that fight, and something genuinely unprecedented was born. A real American family turning their actual lives into weekly entertainment. Decades before reality, television became a cultural obsession. The Nelsons were already living it. Ricky was 8 years old and already cashing professional paychecks, while other boys his age were collecting baseball cards and scraping their knees on neighborhood sidewalks. Ricky was memorizing scripts, sitting under studio lights, and learning what it meant to perform on demand. Fame arrived before adolescence did, and it never really left room for a normal childhood. There was something else most people didn't know about Ricky during those early years. He struggled intensely with asthma. It kept him home from school more often than not, isolated from friendships, and sometimes left him breathless from the simplest physical effort. That forced stillness shaped him in unexpected ways. He became a listener, an observer, quiet and thoughtful in a way that didn't quite match the loud, energetic world he was professionally required to inhabit. The family's home in Brentwood, California became almost as famous as the family itself. It appeared regularly on the television show, and fans would actually drive past just to see it in person. But inside those walls, the atmosphere was closer to a production office than a family home. Ozzie ran everything with precision. Scripts were drafted in the living room. Rehearsals happened after dinner. The line between real life and the performance was never clearly drawn. And for Ricky, that ambiguity would follow him for the rest of his life. In 1957, everything shifted. Ricky was 17 years old and going through what most teenagers go through. He was trying to impress a girl. The girl in question was a classmate, and Ricky decided that learning to sing like Elvis Presley might do the trick. He talked his father into letting him perform on the family's television show. What happened next, nobody fully predicted. He performed Fats Domino's I'm Walkin', and the response was immediate and overwhelming. Teenage girls across America lost their minds. The single sold over 1 million copies. Overnight, the quiet kid with asthma and a complicated home life became the new face of American cool. Here's what made Ricky's rise genuinely different from other teen idols of the era. He had a built-in weekly television audience of roughly 10 million households. Every single episode of The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet became a promotional vehicle. His father, who was producing the show, brilliantly worked Ricky's musical performances into the storyline itself. By the time a new single-hit record stores, half of America had already heard it, performed live on their television sets. That kind of marketing infrastructure simply did not exist for anyone else. His debut album, simply titled Ricky, came out in late 1957 and went straight to the top of the charts. He was the youngest solo artist to ever reach that position, his very first single on Imperial Records' Bebop. Baby had racked up an extraordinary 750,000 advance orders before it was even pressed and shipped. When it finally arrived in stores, it flew past the million mark almost immediately. And then came the moment that locked his name into history permanently. In August 1958, Poor Little Fool became the very first song to reach #1 on Billboard's newly created Hot 100 chart. The song had been written by a 15-year-old girl named Sharon Sheely, and Ricky almost didn't record it. He wasn't enthusiastic about it. His label pushed it anyway. Radio stations embraced it immediately. It sat at the top for 2 weeks and crossed over into both country and rhythm and blues charts. That distinction, first #1 on the Hot 100, belongs to Ricky Nelson and nobody else, ever. It cannot be replicated or surpassed. And decades after his death, that historical footnote alone would continue, generating royalties and licensing income that his estate would eventually have to fight tooth and nail to actually collect. Between 1957 and 1962, Ricky placed 20 songs in the top 40. The only artist who surpassed that number during the same period was Elvis Presley. He starred alongside John Wayne and Dean Martin in the 1959 film Rio Bravo, and earned a Golden Globe nomination for Most Promising Newcomer. He was, by any measurable standard, at the center of American popular culture. Behind the gold records and the magazine covers, something else was building quietly. Ricky had met Kristen Harmon on Christmas Day in 1961. She was 16. He was 21. She was the daughter of football legend Tom Harmon and actress Elise Knox, and the sister of a young man who would grow up to become television star Mark Harmon. On paper, this was a Hollywood fairy tale, 2 famous families, 2 attractive young people, a romance built in the spotlight. The wedding happened on April 20th, 1963, and it was not what it appeared to be from the outside. Kristen was already pregnant. Her Catholic family insisted on a rapid ceremony. Ricky, who was not Catholic, was required to formally pledge to raise their children in the faith and to attend Catholic instruction classes before the ceremony could proceed. He complied. But compliance and genuine choice are very different things, and Ricky Nelson had spent his entire life doing what others required of him. They had 4 children together, Tracy, twins, Gunnar and Matthew, and Sam. For a while, the family maintained the appearance of Hollywood success. Kristen even joined the television show, playing herself alongside the rest of the family. But 2 incomes flowing in meant very little when the spending had no ceiling. Ricky lived large, custom clothing, luxury vehicles, a lifestyle that matched the one he had performed since childhood. Kristen wanted comfort and stability. Ricky needed to keep working, keep touring, keep earning, just to keep up with what they were spending together. When his musical popularity cooled during the British invasion of the mid-1960s, when the Beatles essentially reshuffled every deck in the music industry, the money problems accelerated. In February 1964, the Beatles appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show, and American popular music was never the same again. Artists who had dominated the previous decade were suddenly scrambling. Elvis went quiet. Ricky's chart positions collapsed. A song called For You that year barely scraped into the top 40. The era he had helped define was over, and the new one had no obvious place for him. What Ricky did next is something very few people remember correctly. Rather than simply disappear, he fought back, artistically. In 1969, he formed the Stone Canyon Band, deliberately blending country and rock music at a moment when that combination was not commercially fashionable. He recruited Randy Meisner, a bassist who would later become a founding member of the Eagles. The music was genuinely innovative, but audiences weren't ready. Venues got smaller, and the money kept shrinking. Then came October 1971. Madison Square Garden. A nostalgia concert called a rock and roll revival. Ricky walked on stage with his new sound, his new band, his new look, and the crowd booed him. He had dropped the boyish Ricky in favor of the more adult Rick. He played a I, Rolling Stones cover. The audience wanted, "Hello, Mary Lou." They wanted the teenager from the television show. They did not want whoever this man had become. He eventually came back out and played the old songs. The crowd cheered, but something had broken inside him that night that never fully healed. Out of that wreckage, though, came something extraordinary. In 1972, Rick, sat down and wrote Garden Party. It was entirely autobiographical, brutally honest. The chorus delivered a line that became one of the most quoted in the history of American pop music. You can't please everyone, so you got to please yourself. The song climbed to number 6 on the Billboard Hot 100. It went gold. For the first time in nearly a decade, Rick Nelson had a genuine hit record. But the industry had already moved on, and the follow-up singles went nowhere. By the mid-1970s, he was playing smaller venues, taking television appearances when he could get them, and watching his financial situation deteriorate rapidly. The marriage finally collapsed under the weight of it all. Kristen moved his belongings out while he was on tour. The divorce proceedings lasted 5 years and consumed over $1 million in legal fees alone. Rick was ordered to pay $4,000 per month in child support. He was awarded joint custody of his 4 children. He was also, by most accounts, nearly financially destroyed. By 1985, Rick Nelson needed money badly enough to make dangerous decisions. He purchased a used 1944 Douglas DC-3 aircraft for $118,000. It had previously belonged to Jerry Lee Lewis. The plane was notoriously unreliable. Band members were frightened of it. Spouses begged their husbands not to board it. There had already been multiple emergency landings and mechanical failures. But Rick refused to travel by bus, and the plane was cheaper than commercial flights when you were moving an entire touring band. On December 31st, 1985, the plane departed for Dallas, where Rick was scheduled to perform a New Year's Eve concert. Somewhere over DeKalb, Texas, smoke began filling the cabin. It grew so dense that the pilots lost visibility of their instruments entirely. The plane clipped trees, hit the ground, and erupted into flames. The wreckage spread across 150 yards of a Texas field. The 2 pilots survived by climbing out through the cockpit windows. Everyone else aboard perished. Rick Nelson was 45 years old. His fiancée, Helen Blair, died alongside him, as did 5 members of his band and crew. sound technician Donald Clark Russell, pianist Andy Chapin, drummer Rick Intfeld, guitarist Bobby Neal, and bassist Patrick Woodward. The music world went into shock, and then the lawyers arrived. What followed Rick Nelson's death was one of the most complicated estate battles in entertainment history, and it unfolded across multiple decades. Initially, the situation looked grim. The estate appeared to be roughly $1 million in debt. Rick's ex-wife, Kristen, moved to take control of the estate on the assumption that no valid will existed. His fiancée, Helen Blair, had no legal standing. His mother was not included. It seemed like there was nothing to fight over except obligation. Then Rick's brother David produced a will, dated just 4 months before the crash. It named Rick's 4 children, Tracy, Gunnar, Matthew, and Sam, as the sole heirs. David was appointed executor. The will was valid, but with the debts piling up and creditors circling, nobody was certain there was anything of real value left to protect. Kristen challenged David's role in court. She also attempted to claim Rick's life insurance, money, despite the fact that their divorce had been finalized years earlier. The legal fighting intensified. Old accusations resurfaced, drug use, financial recklessness, allegations going back years. The children, ranging from their late teens to early 20s, watched their parents' relationship become a courtroom spectacle even in death. And then the other complication emerged. In 1980, Rick had a brief affair with a woman named Georgian Crew. A son named Eric Jude Crew was born as a result. Rick initially denied paternity. A court-ordered blood test in 1981 confirmed he was the father. He was ordered to pay child support of $400 per month, which, according to reports, he eventually stopped paying. When Rick wrote his will, he noted that paternity remained disputed, and deliberately excluded Eric entirely. After Rick died, Georgian fought for her son's rightful share of the estate. The court ultimately upheld the will, as written. Eric received nothing. Meanwhile, Helen Blair's family filed a wrongful death lawsuit over the crash itself, citing what they described as catastrophic neglect in the maintenance of the aircraft. The families of other passengers joined the action. Creditors continued filing claims. The estate that appeared worthless was being picked apart from every direction. What nobody had fully calculated yet was what the music was actually worth. Here is where the story becomes genuinely astonishing. Ricky Nelson had spent decades creating music that never stopped generating money. His catalog included the first #1 on the Billboard Hot 100. It included 20 top 40 hits from a 5-year span that rivaled Elvis Presley's output. It included songs that were constantly being licensed, streamed, covered, and broadcast. The problem was that very little of that money was reaching his children. In 2011, the Nelson estate filed a lawsuit against Capitol Records, demanding between $100 million and $250 million. The legal complaint alleged that Capitol had been systematically underpaying the estate using accounting practices that were, to put it plainly, fraudulent. One of the most egregious examples involved something called breakage fees, deductions originally invented during the era of physical vinyl records to account for the fact that a percentage of records would shatter during shipping. Capitol was still applying those deductions to digital downloads. Downloads don't break. There is no physical product. The deduction existed purely to reduce what the estate was owed. The lawsuit also alleged that Capitol was holding enormous sums in what it categorized as unmatched income, money that, the label claimed, could not be attributed to any specific artist. The estate argued that a substantial portion of that unmatched pool belonged to Rick Nelson and had been sitting there, quietly accumulating, while the label did nothing to distribute it. Capitol also refused, according to the lawsuit, to allow independent auditors full access to its accounting records. Without that access, the estate had no way of knowing the true scope of what was being withheld. In 2014, the case settled. The specific dollar amount was not publicly disclosed, but the estate's legal team described the outcome as a landmark result. Capitol also committed to greater transparency in its accounting practices going forward. The settlement was significant, enough that it fundamentally changed the financial situation of Rick Nelson's children. But it wasn't over. In 2020, the estate went after Sony Music. This lawsuit focused specifically on international streaming revenue and a practice known as intercompany fees. Essentially, Sony, various international offices charging each other for services and using those internal charges to reduce the royalties flowing outward. The estate calculated that in some cases, up to 68% of royalties were being consumed by these internal deductions before a single dollar reached Rick Nelson's heirs. The Sony case settled for $12.7 million. On top of the lump sum, the estate secured a 36% increase in streaming royalties going forward. It was a permanent structural change to how Rick Nelson's music earnings would be calculated and distributed. Not just a one-time payment, but a lasting adjustment that would continue, generating additional income for the Nelson family for years to come. What Rick Nelson left behind when that plane went down in a Texas field on New Year's Eve, 1985, was not immediately visible to anyone. The debts were real. The chaos was real. The legal battles were enormous and expensive and emotionally devastating. But underneath all of it sat a catalog of music that the streaming revolution would eventually transform into something worth fighting over. Poor Little Fool Alone, the first #1 on the Hot 100, carries a historical significance that guarantees it will be licensed, discussed, and celebrated as long as people study American music history. Garden Party remains one of the most honest and emotionally resonant songs of its era. His recordings with the Stone Canyon Band, while commercially overlooked during his lifetime, have been critically reassessed as genuinely ahead of their time. Gunnar and Matthew Nelson, the twins, went on to form their own music group, Nelson, and scored a #1 hit of their own in 1990 with After the Rain. They continued performing their father's music on the road for years, keeping the catalog alive in front of audiences who might otherwise never have encountered it. Tracy Nelson became a respected actress. The family, despite everything that had tried to pull them apart, maintained a connection to the music and to each other. The record label lawsuits against Capitol and then against Sony established legal precedents that benefited not just the Nelson estate, but other artists, and estates pursuing similar claims. The argument that digital-era royalties could not be reduced using physical-era accounting deductions was not unique to Rick Nelson. Many estates and living artists had been losing money to identical practices for years. Rick Nelson died broke by most conventional measures, but his children did not stay that way. There is something genuinely poetic about the arc of Rick Nelson's story, even in its tragedy. He spent his entire life performing for other people's expectations. His childhood belonged to his parents' television show. His teen years belonged to the record labels and the fans. His marriage was conducted, partly in public. His attempts to evolve artistically were rejected by audiences who preferred the version of him that had already been packaged and sold. He died trying to meet the demands of a touring schedule he couldn't afford to cancel. And yet, long after he was gone, the music he created quietly accumulated value that nobody, not the creditors, not the lawyers, not even his own family, fully understood in the immediate aftermath of that crash. The record labels certainly understood it. They had been quietly profiting from it for decades. It took decades of legal battles, persistence, and some landmark settlements to finally redirect that wealth back to the people who were supposed to receive it. The lesson here is not just about Ricky Nelson. It is about who actually benefits from creative work, how long that fight for fair compensation can take, and what a name and a catalog can be worth long after the person behind them is no longer here to advocate for themselves. What do you think about how the music industry treated Rick Nelson's legacy? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We genuinely want to hear from you. If this story surprised you, share it with someone who grew up listening to him. Hit the like button if you made it to the end, and make sure you subscribe so you don't miss stories like this one. We cover the moments behind the headlines, the ones most people never hear about. See you in the next one.